Hello, my name is Lo, and I am currently in thought. Since I graduated from college, I've spent a couple months traveling around the world, and part of the reason for this was so that I could see different parts of the world, and part of the reason for this was so that I could take some time to myself and reflect on who I am and what I want to do with the rest of my life. And especially now that I'm stuck inside due to worldwide pandemic, I have a lot of time for reflection. And lately I've been thinking a lot about what it means to be creative, both in a philosophical sense and in practical terms. And I wanted to share some of those thoughts on that question of, am I creative? So first, I think it's important to define what I mean by being creative. And this is actually a pretty hard thing to do once you start asking questions. I mean, is there a difference between creating and being creative? I'm creating this video right now, so does that automatically mean that I'm creative? Can I just shut off the video and say yes and that's it? Well, it's a little more complicated than that, right? I mean, I think most people would agree that for people in a factory, creating things all day but having no say in the design of the things they're creating, they're not really being creative. On the other hand, what about a writer who is super creative typically, but is experiencing writer's block, so isn't currently creating anything? I think when it comes down to it, a lot of these questions are really getting at the core question of, is creativity more concerned with what you think or what you produce? So I made some Instagram stories asking these questions to try to get some perspectives from some of my friends, and I got some pretty interesting answers. First, I asked, what makes a person creative? And one of my friends answered, the innate desire to make and or do something inventive as if driven by some force. So by this definition, creativity is about what you think. And when I asked straight up, is creativity more concerned with a person's thoughts and ideas or physically produced art, 93% of the people who responded said thoughts and ideas. And even one of the people who said the opposite answer told me later she accidentally clicked the wrong button. So obviously, based on this, a large majority of at least my friends think that creativity is about the drive to create, not necessarily the act of creating. But then I asked, how can a person start being creative? And most of the answers were very product-based, saying that the way that you start being creative is by just sitting down and creating something. And that suggested a bit of conflict. Then the next question I asked, how can people stop being creative? I think the answers gave a bit of nuance. One of my friends specifically pointed out the difference between creating and being creative and said that when you lack the physical and emotional energy needed to create, that's when you stop being creative. Multiple people also talked about the external and internal pressures that exist regarding creation and how when you let those pressures influence what you make, that's when you stop being creative. Based on these answers, first of all, being creative does necessitate that you are at least able to create something. And number two, that something has to be genuine. Truly creative things are coming from you alone. And I think that this focus on genuineness is what people are getting at when they say creativity is more about your thoughts and ideas. I mean, 92% of people on my story responded that unique doodles on a napkin is more creative than a perfect replica of Starry Night. So based on that, creativity definitely does require that element of unique expression of a unique self. I also think it's worth noting that no one suggested at any point that creativity has anything at all to do with the quality of your work. It's not about whether it's good or bad, it's just about the fact that it's yours and it's genuine. Synthesizing all of these ideas, I think a good definition of creativity based on what my friends on Instagram say is this. Creativity is the ability to genuinely externalize one's unique internal experiences. how does that definition compare to dictionary definitions? The Oxford Dictionary defines creativity as the use of imagination or original ideas to create something. Way to use the word in its definition, Oxford. And the Cambridge Dictionary defines creativity as the ability to produce original and unusual ideas or to make something new or imaginative. The Oxford definition suggests that creation is required for creativity, while the Cambridge definition comes to the same conclusion I did and says it's more about the ability to create. Both of these definitions use the word imagination, which I didn't use in mine because I think it's a bit redundant. They both also include the word original, which honestly opens up a whole new can of worms about if originality even exists, and where's the line between inspiration and copying, and how different does something have to be from everything else in order to be considered original. And I don't want to get into that. And I don't even think it's the best word to use, because I think when being creative, it's more important that it is genuine than that it is original. If you had two people on different sides of the world who never met each other but happened to write the same poem or something, and it was genuine to both of them but not original, would you call either of those works of art less creative? I don't think so. And if a pianist expresses their emotions through playing a Mozart piece, I think they're still being creative, even though they're not necessarily being original. So yeah, I think I'm going to stick with my own definition and not alter it based on those official dictionary definitions. And now that I finally have a definition of creativity that I feel comfortable with, I have to ask if that is applicable to me. Am I creative by this definition that I came up with? Well, in order to answer this, I think I need to go back and reflect a little bit on some of my earlier life. I was definitely a creative child. I used to write short stories all the time. Whenever I got bored in school, which was pretty frequent, I would start handwriting stories in my notebooks and then abandon them after 2 pages because I couldn't keep up with my ideas and I just got bored with that too. During my childhood, I definitely saw writing short stories as cathartic. I would write characters that resembled me in some way and put them in situations and see how they react, and it was fun for me. But despite the fact that I was creating on a pretty much daily basis, I never considered myself creative because my narrow definition of that word pretty much only focused on visual art. And since I didn't draw really as a kid, I didn't consider myself creative. I even remember one specific day at a restaurant, my mom told her friend that I was creative, and I got super uncomfortable and I was like, no, I'm not. Stop lying about me. Then in high school and college, I started seeing myself as like creative adjacent, like somebody who supports creative people but isn't really creative myself. I no longer had the time or motivation to do creative writing, so the only things I really produced were like academic papers and a couple of raunchy fanfics that still exist on the internet somewhere. In high school, my friend and I put together a girl zine with our feminism club, where we collected drawings and poetry and photography and other kinds of art about what it means to be a woman and put it together in a little booklet. And even though looking back, putting together that booklet required a pretty substantial amount of creativity on my part, I still didn't really see myself as creative. I saw myself as like the facilitator of creativity, the collector of creativity, but not creative myself. And that kind of attitude towards myself continued on in college when I became involved in a dorm that focused on creative expression. I often saw myself as a supporter and enabler of arts rather than an artist. I would organize creative events, but I wouldn't really participate in them myself. Sure, I would write journal entries that occasionally sounded poetic, or every once in a while I would get a fit of inspiration and draw whatever I saw in front of me that looked pretty, but I wasn't ever really doing anything with any amount of consistency. I did play piano and guitar all through high school and college, but even with that, I was only ever like playing chords and singing along to other people's songs or learning sheet music that other people had written. So again, I didn't really see any of that work as creative because it wasn't original. And I think, honestly, looking back during this time, I think I just got so in my own head that it was impossible for me to even start. I mean, I was surrounded by all of these incredibly talented people, and I just felt so inadequate. Like, I remember right after I graduated from college, and I was living with a really good friend of mine who's a fantastic songwriter, and she asked if I wanted to write a song with her. And I really did. I really wanted to do it. But when it came time to actually write the song, I just became so overwhelmed with my own feelings of inadequacy and incompetence that I just started crying and couldn't do anything. That being said, I did take 2 courses over my 4 years at college that forced me to be creative. One was an art class that was a nice mixture of art history and academics that I felt really comfortable with, and then actually making art, which was honestly very uncomfortable for me at the time. But luckily, the first project in that class was to make like a Dada booklet. And with Dada, the whole point of it is that it's random and meaningless, so that was a really good way for me to get out of my head and actually get things on paper, because it doesn't matter if it's good. It's not supposed to be good, you know what I mean? And then the other project that I really liked during that class was this screen printing project where I was able to do a little bit of graphic design. And while I was doing that, I realized I had been doing creative graphic design work for the last 2 years because I was the publicist for my student organizations. So I was making event posters and flyers and stuff like that. And I was being pretty creative with it, but I just never really saw it as creative work. The other course I took was called Writing for Stage and Screen, where we were required to write 1 3 to 5 page scene each week. And at some point, after being forced to write so many short pieces, it became much less of a big deal to actually sit down and do creative writing again, like I had done as a kid. And while I was taking that course, I was going through a lot in my personal life, and eventually I was finally able to get back to the point where I could use that creative outlet of writing as an emotional expression. So I'm very, 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 very glad that I took those 2 courses in college. And as a side note, I know a lot of people, when you go to college, you see it as like job training, and you're like, I want to be a doctor, so I'm just going to take all of my doctor classes and that's it. Or I want to be a lawyer, so I'm going to take all of my lawyer classes and that's it. And a lot of people, I think, have a negative perception of like arts classes in college. Maybe they see it as a waste of money or a waste of time. But honestly, being in that environment where I was forced to create, I think that was really, really helpful to me, because if I don't have structure, if I don't have something kind of forcing me to do it, a lot of the time I'm just not going to do it. So I do think that arts courses in college can be incredibly valuable. And if anybody is ever considering taking an art class, even if you think it's going to be a waste of time, just try it. 1 course. Highly recommend taking arts courses in college if you have the opportunity. So since leaving college, I've tried to be creative. I've partially gotten over my fear of songwriting, and I've written like 5-ish almost 5. I'm working on the 5th right now. Full songs. I had a brief period where I was making a lot of like little wire jewelry. I've been slowly, very slowly, writing a screenplay about working at a coffee shop. I've made a couple videos on this channel that could be considered on the artsy side. But does any of that mean that I am, as an essential part of my being, a creative person? And hell, is this rambly introspective video an example of me being creative as well? Well, going back to the definition that I came up with, I think, yeah. I mean, all of these are examples of me externalizing my unique internal experiences. And if anything, I would call them even more genuine than the stuff I made during my college classes, because I made them all for me and not for a professor who's going to be grading me. After reflecting on a lot of my past experiences with creativity, I'm realizing I've engaged in a lot of negative self-talk and devaluing of my own work throughout my life. I've continually put myself down and seen the things I produce as not creative enough, when really I've been doing creative things my entire life. Even when I was doing things that weren't creative per se, I was doing them creatively. Like, honestly, looking back, I showed a lot of creativity when I was organizing open mic nights and designing event posters. And that creativity isn't any less valid than the creativity people show when they paint a picture. And, you know, maybe I was just drawn to arts facilitation because it had a structure and I could let my creativity out in the details instead of just having a blank piece of paper that seemed so open-ended and directionless. Maybe that's just the way that I subconsciously worked out in order to let out my creativity. It's taken me a really long time to figure out that my forms of creativity are valid, and that devaluing has had a pretty negative effect throughout my life. I mean, art and creation are supposed to be ways for people to express themselves and funnel their emotions into something productive and relate to other people. But I've been denying myself that outlet because I've been so self-critical and dismissive of everything I create because I see myself as not creative enough. I've been so judgmental of whether everything I create is good enough that I've been too afraid to ever create in the first place, and I've lost a lot of that innate creativity. And it's taking a long time to build myself back up to the point where I can express it again. So, looking forward, I think I need to be a little easier on myself and give myself credit for my creativity. And I'm not saying that everything I make is going to be amazing and deserves awards and I should have devoted fans to my work. I'm not saying any of that. But what I am saying is that the things I create are genuine and honest, and they're important to me, if not to anyone else. And I should be proud of the things that I have made in the past and will continue to make in the future, even if they're not amazing. I am a creative person, and I do genuinely think that every person can be creative. But I think pushing yourself to create something kind of might help you tap into that creativity that's been lying dormant all along. All right, that's all I really had to say. Thank you for listening to my introspective ramblings on the question, am I creative? Yes, I am. And I think everyone else is too. We all just kind of have to let that creativity flow. Thanks again for watching, and I will make another video soon, hopefully, and continue being creative on this channel.